Three tiny German Shepherd puppies stood in the heart of a record-breaking Maine blizzard, their small paws lifted toward the gray sky in a desperate, silent plea. To any other passerby, it looked like a prayer for mercy. But to Nolan Briggs, a man who had spent his life in the shadows of combat, it looked like a tactical report. Nolan had moved to the frozen edge of the world to escape the echoes of Kabul and the ghost of his K9 partner Ares. He thought he had left the war behind, but as their rhythmic wailing pierced the howling wind, he realized the war hadn't just followed him home, it had reported for duty. These weren't just puppies, they were messengers. And the secret they carried in their shivering bodies was about to shatter the silence Nolan had fought so hard to keep. Before we get deep into the story, please let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Hit subscribe if you're hooked in and ready to enjoy this story, because tomorrow, I have another beautiful story to share with you and I don't want you to miss it for anything. Now let's get into the story. The morning was a vast, unforgiving stretch of white. In northern Maine, the cold doesn't just bite, it swallows you whole. Nolan Briggs stepped out of his cabin, a structure that was more a fortress than a home, feeling the familiar weight of isolation. At 42, his body carried the map of a dozen deployments, and his eyes held a stillness that only comes from seeing too much. He lived for the silence. It was the only thing that drowned out the memory of the explosion that had taken his hearing in one ear and his heart's purpose in the other. But today the silence was broken. A high-pitched, rhythmic cry drifted through the pines. Nolan trudged through the knee-deep powder, his breath hitching as he saw them. Three fragile lives, Coco, Minnie, and Sprout, huddled together. As he approached, the puppy on the right, Sprout, stared at him with an intensity that felt eerily familiar. Then they did it. Simultaneously, the puppies rose on their hind legs, front paws tucked in a specific rigid, begging gesture. Nolan froze. His heart, long since turned to ice, hammered against his ribs. This wasn't a trick for a treat. It was a high-level tactical alert used only by elite K9 units, a signal he himself had taught to only one dog, Ares. As Nolan reached out to scoop the freezing puppies into his heavy veteran's coat, he noticed something that made his blood run colder than the storm. Tucked into the makeshift collar of the smallest pup was a microchip casing engraved with his late commander's initials. Nolan realized then that the great white blizzard wasn't his biggest threat. Someone had sent these puppies to find him, and the mercenaries tracking them wouldn't be far behind. He wasn't just rescuing strays. He was holding the only living evidence of a conspiracy that had claimed his unit's lives. The puppies didn't just need a home, they needed a soldier. The cold in northern Maine was not a weather condition. It was a physical weight, a silent, predatory thing that pressed against the logs of the cabin until they groaned like old bones. Nolan Briggs stood by the frosted window of his kitchen, watching the world disappear. For 3 days, the sky had been a bruised, heavy purple, and now it had finally broken, spilling a record-shattering blizzard across the hinterlands. The pines, usually tall and proud sentinels of the forest, were bowed low under the weight of the powder, looking like hunched ghosts in the dim morning light. Nolan took a sip of his coffee, black and bitter, the steam rising to meet the cold air that leaked through the window sill. He didn't mind the leak. In fact, he preferred the bite of the air. It was a reminder that he was still alive, even if he spent most of his days trying to forget why. At 42, Nolan moved with a measured, economical precision, a relic of a life lived in tactical increments. His shoulders were broad, though they carried a slight permanent hunch, as if he were always bracing for a shockwave that had already passed. He wore a faded army-issue thermal and wool trousers, his feet tucked into thick sheepskin slippers. To the few people in the town of Allagash who had seen him, he was just a quiet veteran who bought his supplies in bulk and never stayed for a second beer at the local tavern. They called him a hermit, a survivalist, maybe even a little touched by the war. Nolan didn't care what they called him. In the silence of the woods, labels didn't mean anything. Only the routine mattered. The routine was his fortress. He woke at 0430, a habit the military had burned into his DNA. He fed the wood stove, cleared the internal vents, checked his perimeter cameras, and prepared his gear. Even though he had no missions, no unit, and no commanding officer, his rifle was always cleaned, and his first aid kit was always stocked. It was the only way to keep the echoes at bay. If he stayed busy, the screaming stopped. If he stayed focused, the smell of burning diesel and scorched sand stayed buried beneath the scent of pine and kerosene. But this morning, the silence was thicker than usual. The blizzard had knocked out the power lines 2 days ago, and the hum of the world had been replaced by the rhythmic thrum of the wind. Nolan sat at his small wooden table, his eyes drifting to the corner of the room. There, tucked away in the shadows, sat an old, frayed nylon leash and a heavy-duty K9 tactical vest. On the side of the vest, a patch read, Aries. Nolan's hand instinctively went to his right ear, where the skin was scarred and the hearing was nearly non-existent. He could still feel the heat of that day in Kabul. The dust had been so thick it felt like breathing glass. He remembered the way Aries, his Belgian Malinois partner, had suddenly stiffened. The dog hadn't barked, he had given a sharp, low-frequency huff, a tactical alert. Moments later, the world had turned into a roar of fire and flying metal. Nolan had survived the IED, but Aries hadn't. The dog had taken the brunt of the blast, shielding Nolan's lower half from the worst of the shrapnel. In the aftermath, as Nolan lay in the dirt, blood trickling from his ears, he had reached out and felt Aries's fur one last time. It had been the last time Nolan felt a sense of purpose. He had come to Maine to die in slow motion, or at least to live in a way that wouldn't hurt anyone else. He called himself a jinx, a magnet for tragedy. If he stayed alone, the world was safe from him and he was safe from the world. He shook the memory away and stood up, his knee clicking, a parting gift from a jump in the Hindu Kush. He needed more wood from the porch. The storm was supposed to get worse before it got better, and he couldn't afford to let the stove go out. As he reached for the heavy iron latch of his front door, a sound cut through the roar of the wind. It was faint, high-pitched, and entirely out of place. Nolan froze. He tilted his head, using his good ear to scan the frequency of the storm. At first, he thought it was the wind whistling through the eaves, or perhaps a coyote caught in the whiteout. But then it came again. A rhythmic, desperate wailing. It wasn't the wild cry of a predator. It was domestic. It was small. And it was terrified. No, Nolan whispered to the empty room. Not today. He tried to ignore it. He sat back down and reached for his coffee, but his hand hovered over the mug. The sound was persistent. It was a cry for help that he recognized in his marrow. It was the sound of a soldier calling for a medic. It was the sound of a child lost in a crowd. Against his better judgment, Nolan stood up and grabbed his heavy parka. He jammed his feet into his tactical boots, cinching the laces with a series of quick, practiced jerks. He grabbed a flashlight and stepped out onto the porch. The world was a wall of white. The snow was coming down so fast it felt like being underwater. Nolan squinted, the freezing air stinging his eyes. He stepped off the porch, sinking mid-thigh into the fresh powder. The wind tried to push him back, but he leaned into it, his internal compass guiding him toward the sound. The cries were coming from the edge of his clearing, near a stand of ancient hemlocks. He pushed forward, his breath coming in ragged plumes of frost. He felt the familiar surge of adrenaline, that old soldier mode clicking into place. His mind began to map the terrain, looking for cover, looking for threats, even though there was nothing but snow. He saw a flash of color, something dark against the blinding white. He slowed his pace, his hand instinctively reaching for a sidearm that wasn't there. He approached the base of a fallen log, and that's when he saw them. 3 tiny shapes were huddled together, their fur already dusted with ice. They were German Shepherd puppies, no more than 6 or 7 weeks old. Their black and tan coats were standing on end, and they were shivering so violently that their teeth seemed to chatter. What the hell? Nolan breathed. There were no houses for 5 miles. No roads were passable. There was no way 3 puppies could have ended up here on their own. He looked around for a mother dog, for a person, for anything that explained their presence, but there was only the endless, swirling white. As Nolan took a step closer, the puppies reacted in a way that stopped his heart. They didn't scatter. They didn't run toward him in a clumsy, puppy-like tumble. Instead, the 2 on the left rose onto their hind legs. They lifted their tiny front paws into the air, tucking them against their chests in a rigid, controlled motion. The third puppy, the one on the right with a distinctive white speck on its ear, stayed seated but stared directly at Nolan with a piercing, intelligent gaze that felt far too old for its tiny frame. Nolan stopped dead in his tracks. His flashlight beam wavered. He knew that gesture. He had spent 4 years at the K9 training facility in North Carolina teaching that exact stance. It wasn't a beg. It was a tactical alert. It was the signal a dog gave when it had found a target but had to remain silent. It was a gesture meant to be seen by a handler from a distance, a way to report for duty without alerting the enemy. No, Nolan whispered, the word lost in the wind. That's not possible. He had taught that specific variation, the double paw lift, only to a handful of dogs in the Special Operations Program. It was a signature of the Aries line, a bloodline of super dogs that were supposed to be the pinnacle of military intelligence. But Aries was dead. The program had been shuttered years ago after the cobble ambush. The puppies didn't move. They held the stance even as the snow began to bury their paws. They were looking at him as if they expected a command. They were looking at him as if they knew him. The cold seemed to vanish, replaced by a searing heat in Nolan's chest. He moved forward, dropping to his knees in the snow. He didn't care about the frostbite or the storm. He reached out his scarred hands and the puppies finally broke formation. They tumbled into him, a chaotic mass of cold fur and warm tongues. They let out little whimpers of relief, burrowing into the folds of his parka. Nolan scooped them up one by one. Coco, Minnie, and Sprout. He didn't know their names yet, but he felt the weight of them against his chest, the fragile, fluttering pulse of 3 lives that shouldn't exist. He tucked them inside his jacket, zipping it up so only their heads poked out. The warmth of his body began to seep into them, and for the first time in 3 years, Nolan felt the ice around his own heart crack. As he turned to head back to the cabin, the puppy on the right, the one he would come to call Sprout, let out a sharp, authoritative bark. It wasn't a cry for help this time. It was a warning. Nolan looked back toward the woods. Through the curtain of snow he saw it. A faint red light. It was small, a mere pinprick in the darkness, but it was steady. It was the infrared signature of a long-range optic. Someone was watching. Someone had followed the puppies. Nolan's eyes narrowed, the weariness of the hermit falling away to reveal the steel of the handler. He didn't know who was out there, and he didn't know why these puppies were signaling like soldiers. But as he felt their small hearts beating against his own, he knew one thing for certain. The silence was over. The war had come to the hinterlands, and Nolan Briggs was no longer just a man waiting to die. He was a protector again. He turned and ran toward the cabin, his boots heavy in the snow, his mind already calculating the defense of his fortress. He reached the porch and slammed the door behind him, throwing the heavy iron bolts. He stood in the dim light of the wood stove, the puppies wriggling inside his coat. He looked down at them, his breath coming in hard, sharp gasps. The one called Sprout looked back at him, its dark eyes reflecting the orange glow of the fire. "All right," Nolan whispered, his voice cracking with a decade's worth of unspoken emotion. "Report for duty, soldiers. Let's see what you're trying to tell me." He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. It was dead, but he didn't need it. He walked over to the corner of the room and pulled the tactical vest of Ares out of the shadows. He laid it on the floor, and the 3 puppies immediately crawled onto it, huddling together on the fabric that smelled of the father they had never known. Nolan sat on the floor beside them, the wind screaming against the logs of the cabin. He was alone no longer. The hermit of the hinterlands was gone, replaced by a man who had finally found something worth fighting for. But as the red light from the woods flashed in his memory, he knew that the truth the puppies carried was a death sentence for anyone who held it. He looked at the small, shivering creatures and felt a grim smile touch his lips. "Welcome home," he murmured. "Now let's get to work." The blizzard continued to howl, wrapping the cabin in a shroud of white, but inside, the fire was burning brighter than it had in years. The first chapter of Nolan's new life had begun, and it was written in the snow, signed with the paw prints of 3 tiny heroes. The heavy iron bolt of the cabin door slid into place with a definitive metallic thud that echoed through the small room. Outside, the Maine wilderness continued its assault, the wind screaming through the eaves like a choir of ghosts. But inside, the air was thick with the scent of dry cedar and the sharp ozone tang of the storm Nolan had just dragged in with him. He didn't immediately move. He stood with his back to the door, his chest heaving, the 3 small weights inside his parka wriggling against his ribs. He waited, his good ears strained, listening for the sound of an engine or the crunch of boots on the porch. Nothing came but the white noise of the blizzard. He moved toward the center of the room, his movements stiff and mechanical. With trembling fingers, he unzipped the heavy canvas of his jacket. One by one he lifted the puppies out. He set them down on the frayed K9 tactical vest that still bore Ares' name. The transition from the sub-zero madness outside to the radiant heat of the wood stove was almost too much for the small creatures. They tumbled onto the nylon fabric, their legs shaky, their fur matted with clumps of ice that were already beginning to weep into the weave of the vest. Nolan's training took over, the deep-seated instinct of a man who had spent more time caring for working dogs than he had for himself. He knelt on the floor, ignoring the sharp protest of his scarred knee. He grabbed a clean, thick wool blanket from the foot of his cot and began to vigorously but gently rub the moisture from their coats. He started with the smallest, the one with the white speck on its ear, Sprout. The pup didn't shy away. It didn't nip or whine. It simply stood there, its dark, liquid eyes fixed on Nolan's face with a level of focus that was unnerving. "You're freezing," Nolan murmured, his voice sounding like gravel in the quiet room. "Hold still." He moved to the others, Coco and Minnie. They were slightly larger, their coats a darker shade of sable, but they shared that same eerie stillness. As he dried them, he checked their paws for frostbite, his calloused thumbs moving over their tiny pads. They were pink and cold, but the skin wasn't broken. They had been in the snow for a while, but not long enough to lose limbs. Someone had dropped them recently. Someone had timed this. Once they were dry, the puppies didn't scatter to explore the cabin. They didn't sniff the corners or look for a place to hide. Instead, they huddled together on Aries' vest, forming a tight, defensive triangle. Their ears, still oversized for their heads, were constantly twitching, tracking the sounds of the wind and the settling of the cabin logs. Nolan watched them, his mind racing. He stood up and went to the small kitchenette, pulling a carton of goat's milk and some high-protein emergency broth from his stores. He warmed the mixture in a pan on top of the wood stove, the steam rising in the dim light. As the smell of the food hit the air, the puppies didn't bark or scramble. They sat. They sat in perfect unison, their eyes locked on Nolan's every move. "Hungry, aren't you?" he asked, pouring the mixture into 3 shallow ceramic bowls. He placed the bowls on the floor. Normal puppies would have collided in a flurry of fur and greed. These 3 waited. They looked at each other, then back at Nolan. It wasn't until Nolan gave a sharp 2-finger snap, the universal release command for military working dogs, that they moved. They ate with a silent, disciplined efficiency that made Nolan's skin crawl. "Who trained you?" he whispered, leaning back against the rough-hewn wall. "Who the hell are you?" He looked at Sprout, the smallest of the trio. The puppy had finished its meal first and had returned to its position on the vest. It wasn't just sitting, it was watching the window. Nolan followed the pup's gaze. The red light he had seen in the woods was gone, obscured by the thickening snow, but the memory of it burned in his mind. He wasn't safe. He hadn't been safe the moment he stepped off that porch. As the puppies finished eating, Nolan noticed something. Sprout began to move in a circle, but it wasn't the typical nesting behavior of a dog looking for a place to sleep. The pup was sniffing the seams of Aries' vest. It began to paw at a specific spot, a hidden reinforced pocket on the underside of the vest that Nolan hadn't opened since he returned from Kabul. Nolan crawled back to the center of the room. "What is it, girl? What do you see?" Sprout looked up at him, then let out a low, guttural huff, the exact sound Aries used to make when he found a cache of explosives. Then the puppy did it again. She rose onto her hind legs, lifting her front paws in that rigid, tactical beg. But this time she held it longer, her tiny body trembling with the effort. Coco and Minnie followed suit, creating a line of 3 miniature soldiers reporting to their commander. Nolan's breath hitched. He reached for the vest, flipping it over. His hands found the hidden pocket, the Velcro tearing with a loud, aggressive rip that seemed to startle even the wind. Inside there was nothing but a small silver locket he had kept, a memento of his unit. But as he pulled the locket out, Sprout barked once, sharp and commanding. Nolan looked closer at the puppy. He reached out and gently ran his fingers along Sprout's neck. There, buried deep beneath the thick, tan fur, his fingers snagged on something hard. It wasn't a tick and it wasn't a scab. He grabbed a pair of surgical scissors from his first aid kit and a small LED headlamp. He clicked the light on, the bright white beam illuminating the puppy's neck. He carefully parted the fur. There, embedded just beneath the skin, was a small, translucent casing. It wasn't a standard pet microchip. It was larger, rectangular, and glowed with a faint, pulsing blue LED, a specialized military GPS tracker with an integrated data storage unit. Nolan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the storm. This was the cargo. But there was more. Around the pup's neck, so thin it was almost invisible, was a cord of high-tensile braided wire. Hanging from the wire was a small, titanium disc, no larger than a dime. Nolan used the scissors to snip the wire, catching the disc before it hit the floor. He held the disc up to the light. His vision blurred for a second as he recognized the engraving. On one side was a serial number, 77 Bravo Aries. On the other side were 3 letters that shattered Nolan's world, JMG. Colonel Miller, Nolan choked out. Colonel Jonathan Miller had been Nolan's commanding officer, the man who had handpicked him for the K-9 program. Miller was the one who had sent Nolan and Aries on that final disastrous mission in Kabul. The official report said Miller had died in a helicopter crash 6 months after Nolan was discharged. But these puppies were barely 6 weeks old. The math didn't work. Unless the crash had been a cover-up and Miller had been alive, working in the shadows. Nolan grabbed his old ruggedized laptop from beneath the cot. It was an ancient piece of tech, disconnected from the grid, used only for his private journals. He plugged in a universal interface cable he had kept from his service days. He looked at Sprout. The puppy stood perfectly still, allowing Nolan to press the interface against the glowing casing in her neck. The laptop screen flickered to life, lines of encrypted code scrolling at a dizzying speed. Nolan's heart hammered against his ribs. He wasn't a hacker, but he knew the backdoor codes Miller had taught the unit for emergency data retrieval. He typed in a sequence, "Never leave a fallen comrade." The screen turned black, then a single video file appeared. Nolan hesitated. His finger hovered over the trackpad. He knew that once he clicked that file, his life as a hermit was over. The silence would be gone forever. He looked at the three puppies. They were all watching the screen now, their ears forward, their bodies tense. They knew. Somehow they knew this was the mission. He clicked play. The video was graining, shot in low light. The face of Colonel Miller appeared. He looked 10 years older than the last time Nolan had seen him. His hair was white, his face etched with deep lines of exhaustion and fear. He was in what looked like a sterile, underground kennel. Behind him, the sound of barking, deep, powerful barking, echoed off the walls. "Nolan," Miller's voice came through the small speakers, distorted but unmistakable. "If you're seeing this, then I'm already gone. And the Vanguard group has likely already scrubbed the facility. I'm sorry I couldn't tell you the truth after Kabul. Ares didn't just save your life that day. He provided the genetic baseline for what they're calling the Sentinel Project. They wanted to breed the perfect soldier, loyal, lethal, and capable of processing data faster than a human." Miller paused, looking over his shoulder as a heavy door clanged in the background. "These three, Coco, Minnie, and Sprout, they are the last of the line. The only ones who didn't exhibit the kill switch, aggression. They are Ares' true legacy, Nolan. They are his blood. I've encoded the drive in the lead pup's chip with the evidence of Vanguard's illegal breeding program and the names of the senators on their payroll." Miller leaned closer to the camera, his eyes pleading. "They'll come for them, Nolan. They'll track the chips. You have to get them to the sanctuary. You're the only one who knows how to speak their language. Protect them. For Ares. For me." The video cut to black. The silence that followed was deafening. Nolan sat on the floor, the blue light of the laptop reflecting in his wide, shocked eyes. He looked at the three puppies, the last of Ares' bloodline. They weren't just dogs. They were the key to exposing a multi-billion-dollar conspiracy. And they had been sent to the one man the world thought was too broken to fight back. Suddenly, a sharp, electronic chirp sounded from the laptop. A red map appeared on the screen. 3 blinking dots were centered on his cabin. But circling them, closing in from the south, were 4 other dots. "Microchip activation," Nolan hissed. "They know exactly where we are." He looked at the window. The blizzard was at its peak, a wall of white that should have been a shield. But the Vanguard mercenaries would have thermal imaging, high-altitude drones, and specialized gear. They were coming for the cargo. Nolan stood up, the heaviness in his limbs vanishing, replaced by a cold, predatory clarity. He didn't see 3 puppies anymore. He saw a unit. He saw a responsibility he had spent 3 years trying to outrun. He walked over to a heavy wooden trunk at the foot of his bed. He threw it open, revealing a cache of gear he had promised himself he would never touch again. A suppressed carbine, tactical vests, flashbangs, and a box of specialized canine whistles. He looked at Sprout, who was watching him with that same unwavering focus. "Change of plans," Nolan said, his voice now steady and lethal. "We aren't hiding anymore." He grabbed a roll of black duct tape and began to cover the small gaps in the window shutters, blacking out the cabin. He moved with the grace of a man who had done this 1,000 times in 1,000 different war zones. He checked his watch. The mercenaries were 3 miles out, struggling through the drifts. He had 20 minutes. He looked at the 3 puppies. They had moved off the vest and were now standing by his gear, sniffing the weapons. Coco nudged the box of whistles with her nose. "Yeah," Nolan whispered, a grim, dark humor sparking in his eyes. "You know what to do." He knelt down and began to fit them with makeshift harnesses he fashioned from tactical webbing and paracord. As he worked, he felt the familiar bond forming, the wordless communication between a handler and his dogs. It wasn't the same as Ares, but it was something new, something powerful. "Listen to me," he said, looking each puppy in the eye. "The men coming for you, they aren't friends. They think you're property. They think I'm just a ghost." He stood up, slinging the carbine over his shoulder. He reached out and clicked off the headlamp, plunging the cabin into the orange glow of the dying fire. "Let's show them what happens when you wake a ghost." Sprout let out a low, vibrating growl, a sound that resonated deep in Nolan's chest. The tactical signal had been received. The investigation was over. Now the defense of the hinterlands began. Nolan walked to the back door, the one that led toward the dense hemlock grove. He knew every inch of this terrain, every ravine, every frozen creek. The mercenaries thought they were the hunters. They didn't realize they had just walked into the territory of a man who had nothing left to lose and 3 tiny reasons to live. As he stepped out into the freezing wind, the puppies followed him in a perfect, silent file. The storm was no longer an enemy, it was his greatest ally. The back door of the cabin didn't creak. Nolan had greased the hinges with graphite months ago, a habit of a man who treated silence as his most valuable resource. As he stepped out into the swirling abyss of the blizzard, the world vanished. There was no sky, no ground, only a vertical rushing of white that threatened to scour the skin from his face. Behind him, 3 small shadows slipped through the threshold. They didn't bark. They didn't hesitate. They moved with a synchronized discipline that sent a shiver down Nolan's spine, a shiver that had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. He didn't head for the main trail. He knew the Vanguard mercenaries would be tracking the GPS pings from the puppy's microchips, and they would expect him to take the easiest route toward the road. But Nolan Briggs hadn't survived 3 tours by doing the expected. He turned toward the Black Teeth, a jagged ridge of granite and frozen hemlock that overlooked the ravine. It was a treacherous path in the best of conditions, but in a record-breaking blizzard, it was a death trap for anyone who didn't know the exact placement of every root and stone. "Stay low," Nolan whispered, a command more for himself than the pups, though they instinctively tucked their bellies closer to the snow. He moved with a hunter's grace, his weight distributed to minimize the crunch of the frozen crust. He relied on his good ear, the left one, tilting his head to catch any sound that wasn't the rhythmic thrum of the wind. But he wasn't alone in his surveillance. Sprout, the smallest of the trio, moved at his flank, her ears swiveling like miniature radar dishes. Twice in the first 10 minutes she came to a hard stop, her body vibrating with a low, silent tension. Each time, Nolan froze and seconds later, he would hear it, the distant, mechanical whir of a heavy-duty drone struggling against the gale. The Vanguard group was thorough. They were sweeping the area with thermal optics, looking for the heat signatures of a man and 3 animals. But Nolan had spent years preparing for a moment he hoped would never come. He led the puppies into the cold sinks, a series of natural limestone overhangs where the geothermal temperature of the earth masked the heat of living bodies. As they crested the ridge, the wind hit them with the force of a physical blow. Nolan knelt, pulling the puppies into the lee of a massive boulder. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small handheld scanner he'd modified years ago to detect unauthorized frequencies. Flickered, showing 4 distinct pulses moving up the eastern slope. They were fast. They were using snowmobiles, heavy-treaded, military-grade machines. "They're arrogant," Nolan muttered, his fingers brushing Sprout's head. "They think the tech makes them gods." He looked at the puppies. Their fur was matted with ice again, but their eyes remained bright, alert, and terrifyingly intelligent. He realized then that he wasn't just leading them to safety. He was following the trail they had been bred to find. Sprout nudged his hand, then turned her nose toward the ravine below. She let out that familiar, muffled huff. The crash site. It was another half-mile of brutal descent. Nolan used a length of paracord to tether the puppies to his belt, worried the wind might literally lift their small bodies off the ridge. They moved like a mountain climbing team, Nolan anchoring his boots into the ice while the pups used their low center of gravity to scuttle down the slopes. As they reached the floor of the ravine, the wind died down slightly, muffled by the steep walls of granite. The silence here was even more oppressive. It was the kind of quiet that felt like it was waiting for something to happen. Sprout suddenly broke lead, straining against the paracord. She wasn't begging or alerting now, she was mourning. A soft, high-pitched whine escaped her throat, the first truly puppy sound Nolan had heard from her. He saw it through the haze, a dark, twisted shape wedged between 2 ancient pines. It was a black SUV or what was left of one. The vehicle had rolled down the embankment, its roof crushed like an aluminum can. The windshield was a spiderweb of frosted glass, and the scent of leaked coolant and old blood hung heavy in the air, preserved by the deep freeze. Nolan's heart hammered against his ribs. He approached the driver's side, his carbine raised. The door had been torn off, not by the crash but by someone using a hydraulic spreader. The interior was empty. No body. "Colonel," Nolan whispered the name a prayer. The puppies swarmed the vehicle, sniffing the seats, their tails tucked. Coco and Minnie began to paw at the floorboards in the rear, while Sprout leaped through the shattered back window into the cargo area. Nolan followed her, his flashlight beam cutting through the gloom. The back of the SUV was a mess of tactical gear, empty medical kits, and frozen water bottles. But Sprout wasn't interested in the supplies. She was scratching at a false panel behind the wheel well. Nolan shoved her gently aside and used his combat knife to pry the panel open. It popped with a sharp crack. Inside was a small lead-line security box. On top of the box was a single blood-stained dog tag. Nolan picked it up, his thumb tracing the embossed letters, "Miller, Jonathan." Below the tag sat a ruggedized digital drive and a handwritten note, protected by a waterproof sleeve. "Nolan, if you found the pups, you found the trail. The vehicle was a decoy. I'm heading north to the old extraction point. They think I died in the roll, but I won't last long in this. The drive contains the encryption keys for the pups' internal data. They are the black box of the Sentinel Project. If Vanguard gets them, the world becomes a kennel of monsters. Don't let them win. Find the truth, Jay." Nolan closed his eyes for a brief second, the weight of the mission settling onto his shoulders. It wasn't just about 3 dogs. It was about the man who had been his father in every way that mattered. Suddenly the puppies all went rigid at once. Sprout's ears flattened against her head. She didn't bark. She didn't whimper. She looked at Nolan and then toward the top of the ravine where they had just descended. Crunch. It was faint but unmistakable. The sound of a boot hitting a frozen branch. Then the rhythmic thrum-thrum-thrum of a snowmobile engine being cut to an idle. "They're here," Nolan hissed. He grabbed the security box and shoved it into his pack. He didn't have time to climb back out, not with 3 puppies and a group of professional killers closing in. He looked at the SUV. It was a tomb, but it could also be a trap. He reached into his vest and pulled out 2 flashbangs and a small puck of thermite. He rigged the thermite to the SUV's gas tank, then placed the flashbangs inside the open door, wired to a simple trip string he anchored to a nearby sapling. "Move," he commanded the pups. He led them deeper into the ravine, toward a narrow crevice he knew led to a series of ice caves. They were halfway to the cover when a voice boomed out through a megaphone, the sound distorted by the wind but carrying a chilling, corporate authority. "Nolan Briggs, we know you're down there. You're interfering with private property of the Vanguard Group. Return the cargo and the veterans' benefits will keep flowing. Make it hard and we'll treat you like any other stray." Nolan didn't look back. He kept his eyes on the ground, following the frozen crumb trail of his own memories of this forest. He heard the snowmobiles roar back to life at the top of the ridge. They were going to try and leap the gap or find a way down. Then came the explosion. It wasn't a roar, it was a sharp, blinding crack as the tripwire was triggered. The flashbangs went off first, a strobe light of white against the snow, followed by the searing, white-hot flare of the thermite igniting the remaining fuel in the SUV. The ravine lit up like midday, the shadows of the trees dancing like frantic giants. A scream of surprise and pain echoed down from the ridge. One of the snowmobiles, blinded by the flash, had lost its footing on the icy lip. Nolan heard the terrifying sound of metal tumbling over metal, a heavy engine block crashing through the pines, followed by a sickening crunch as it hit the floor of the ravine. Nolan didn't stop to celebrate. He knew there were at least 3 more units. He reached the crevice, a split in the granite just wide enough for a man and a dog. He shoved the puppies inside first. They scrambled into the darkness, their small paws clicking on the ice. Nolan squeezed in after them, the cold stone pressing against his chest. Inside, the cave opened into a small, cathedral-like chamber of blue ice. It was silent here, the storm's rage reduced to a distant, muffled hum. Nolan collapsed against the wall, his breath coming in jagged, white plumes. He clicked on his red-filtered light, the dim crimson glow reflecting in the eyes of the 3 puppies. They were huddled together, watching him. Sprout stepped forward, her tail giving a single, hesitant wag. She walked over to Nolan and rested her head on his knee. "We're not out of it yet," Nolan whispered, his hand shaking as he reached out to stroke her ears. "But we found the trail. Your father, he was a good man, Sprout. He was the best." He pulled the digital drive from his pack. He knew he needed to see what was on it, but he also knew that the moment he accessed the data, the hunt would enter a new, more lethal phase. Vanguard wouldn't just be looking for puppies anymore. They would be looking to erase every trace of the man who had found them. Nolan looked at the narrow opening of the cave. He could hear the distant shouts of the mercenaries, the sound of them regrouping, calling for backup. They would have dogs of their own soon, trackers that hadn't been bred for mercy. He looked at Coco, Minnie, and Sprout. They weren't just the last of Ares' bloodline. They were his new unit. And as the realization sank in, the last of Nolan's self-imposed exile died away. He wasn't a jinx. He wasn't a ghost. He was the shield. "Get some sleep," he told the puppies, his voice hardening into the tone of a sergeant. "In the morning we stop running. In the morning we go on the offensive." He checked his carbine, the metallic clack of the bolt chambering around sounding like a promise in the frozen dark. The frozen crumb trail had led him to the truth, and the truth had given him back his soul. Outside, the Maine blizzard screamed on, but inside the ice cave, a new kind of storm was brewing, one that the Vanguard group wouldn't see coming until it was too late. The interior of the ice cave was a cathedral of frozen sapphire, lit only by the low, crimson glow of Nolan's filtered headlamp. It was a pocket of impossible silence in the heart of the storm, where the air tasted of ancient minerals and the heavy, metallic scent of the digital drive he had just pulled from the Colonel's wreckage. Nolan sat with his back against a wall of smooth, translucent ice, the cold seeping through his parka and into his marrow, but he barely felt it. His focus was entirely on the 3 small lives huddled between his boots. Coco and Minnie had finally succumbed to exhaustion, their small bodies rising and falling in a synchronized rhythm of deep, twitching sleep. But Sprout remained awake. She sat on the edge of Ares' old tactical vest, her head cocked, her dark eyes following the movement of Nolan's hands as he worked the ruggedized laptop. The machine's fan whirred, a lonely, mechanical buzz in the cavernous dark. Nolan's fingers, stiff with cold and scarred from years of handling heavy equipment, danced across the keys. He had bypassed the primary encryption using Miller's black box protocols, and now the drive was beginning to spill its secrets. The screen was a waterfall of text, schematics, and high-resolution images that made the bile rise in Nolan's throat. "My God, Ares," Nolan whispered, his voice catching. "What did they do to you?" The drive contained the full history of the Sentinel project. It wasn't just a breeding program as Miller's video had suggested. It was a horrifying marriage of biology and black-budget technology. The documents revealed that the Vanguard group hadn't just valued Ares for his intelligence and loyalty. During his recovery from various injuries throughout his service, they had been harvesting his genetic material, mapping his neural pathways, and eventually, enhancing his offspring with synthetic neural links. Nolan scrolled through a series of lab reports. Ares had been Subject 0. The project's goal was to create a canine that could process tactical data faster than a human handler, a dog that could see infrared signatures, hear encrypted radio frequencies, and execute complex maneuvers without a single spoken command. They were breeding a living weapon system. The Superdog project had gone through several iterations: Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie. The Bravo line, which Ares belonged to, had been the most successful in terms of temperament. But the Charlie line, the synthetics, had been a disaster. The report spoke of high-frequency aggression and total neural cascades. The dogs were too lethal, too unstable. They were biological machines with a kill switch that often tripped prematurely, turning them into rabid killers that couldn't distinguish between friend and foe. Nolan's eyes widened as he found the files on the puppies. Delta 01, Delta 02, Delta 03. Coco, Minnie, and Sprout. They were the pure samples. Miller had secretly altered their genetic sequence to remove the synthetic aggression, effectively stealing the project's only stable assets. These 3 puppies were the only ones who possessed the heightened intelligence and tactical processing of the Sentinel project without the murderous instability. They were a multi-billion-dollar investment that had gone rogue, and to the Vanguard group, they were more valuable than a fleet of stealth bombers. "They aren't just dogs, Sprout," Nolan said, looking down at the puppy. "You're a threat to their entire business model. If the world finds out what they were building, if they see that the project only works when you're humanized, they lose everything." Sprout gave a small, intelligent huff, as if she understood the weight of the revelation. She stood up and walked to the laptop, placing a single, cold paw on the keyboard. A new window popped up, a video file labeled private _. Nolan clicked it. The image that appeared wasn't a lab or a battlefield. It was a grainy, handheld shot of a sun-drenched kennel. In the frame was Colonel Miller, looking younger, sitting on a bench with a younger Ares. The dog's head was in the Colonel's lap, and Miller was laughing. "Nolan," Miller's voice came through the speakers, clearer now that the encryption was broken. "I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you were just a handler and I was just an officer. But we were the only ones who saw them as souls, not sensors. Vanguard thinks they created these puppies, but Ares Ares is the one who gave them their heart. I didn't save these pups because of the data in their heads. I saved them because they are the last bit of goodness left from a project that turned into a nightmare. They are Ares' second chance. And they are yours too. The video ended on a freeze frame of Ares' soulful eyes. Nolan felt a single tear track through the grime on his cheek. He had spent 3 years blaming himself for Ares' death, thinking he had failed his partner. But Ares had been part of a plan far larger and darker than a simple IED in Kabul. The accident that killed Ares had likely been a field test Vanguard allowed to happen, a way to see how the dog performed under terminal stress. The grief that had been a dull, heavy weight for years suddenly sharpened into a cold, diamond-hard rage. Nolan closed the laptop and tucked it into his pack. He looked at the puppies, who were all awake now, sensing the shift in his energy. They stood in a perfect line, their bodies tense, their ears swiveling toward the cave's entrance. "They're coming, aren't they?" Nolan asked. Sprout didn't bark. She let out a low, vibrating growl that seemed to resonate with the very ice of the cave. Nolan reached for his carbine, checking the suppressor. He clicked off his headlamp, plunging the cave into total darkness. In the blackness, he saw something that confirmed the horror of the drive. The puppy's eyes didn't just reflect the light. They were glowing. A faint, bioluminescent green shimmered in their pupils, a side effect of the neural links. They were seeing the thermal heat of the world outside, even through the rock and ice. Then he heard it. It wasn't the sound of snowmobiles or men. It was a sound that made the hair on Nolan's arms stand up. It was a howl, but it was wrong. It was too high, too mechanical, ending in a series of rapid-fire yips that sounded like a modem trying to connect. "The Charlie line," Nolan hissed. "The synthetics." Vanguard hadn't just sent mercenaries. They had sent the failed iterations of the project, the hounds. These were the dogs with the kill-switch aggression, the ones who had been deemed too unstable for combat but perfect for a search-and-destroy mission in the wilderness. The baying grew closer, echoing off the granite walls of the ravine. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated hunger. Nolan could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of large paws hitting the ice outside the crevice. These weren't puppies. These were 100-pound monsters of muscle and wire. "Coco Mini back," Nolan commanded, his voice a low, lethal rasp. He moved toward the narrow opening of the cave, his boots silent on the ice. He could see the faint flicker of flashlights dancing across the snow outside. The mercenaries were close, letting the hounds lead the way. "I have a visual on the crevice," a voice shouted, the same corporate voice from the ravine. "Release the leash. Let the alphas clear the hole." Nolan saw a shadow darken the entrance. A massive head, scarred and twitching, pushed its way into the narrow crack of the cave. The dog's eyes were a fiery, unstable red, and its breath came in wet, metallic rasps. It didn't look like a German shepherd anymore. It looked like a nightmare carved out of shadow. The synthetic dog let out a roar that shook the very foundation of the cave. It lunged forward, its teeth snapping inches from Nolan's face. But Nolan didn't fire. He knew that a gunshot, even suppressed, would give away his exact position to the snipers outside. Instead, he reached into his vest and pulled out the specialized K9 whistle he had found in his gear, the one Miller had labeled ultrasonic override. He blew into it. To a human ear, it was silent. The synthetic dog froze. Its head tilted at an impossible angle, its eyes rolling back into its head. The high-frequency pitch was a direct override to the neural link. For a split second, the monster was paralyzed. "Now," Nolan whispered. Sprout launched herself forward. She didn't bite at the throat, she was too small for that. Instead, she leaped onto the synthetic's snout and nipped at a specific pressure point behind its ear, the off switch for the neural link that Nolan had seen in the schematics. The massive dog let out a whimpering cry and collapsed, its body twitching as the neural link short-circuited. "What happened?" A mercenary shouted from outside. "Alpha 1 is down. What's going on in there?" Nolan didn't wait for an answer. He grabbed a flashbang from his belt and tossed it through the opening. Bang! The white light illuminated the ravine, and in that second, Nolan stepped out of the cave, his carbine raised. He saw 3 mercenaries, their faces covered by high-tech thermal goggles, and 2 more of the massive synthetic dogs. He didn't hesitate. He squeezed the trigger. Thud, thud, thud. The first mercenary went down before he could raise his rifle. The second turned, but Nolan was already moving, using the cover of a fallen pine. The second synthetic dog, seeing its handler fall, lost its discipline. The kill switch tripped. It didn't attack Nolan. It turned on the third mercenary, its jaws locking onto the man's shoulder with bone-crushing force. The ravine erupted in screams and gunfire as the mercenaries began firing wildly at their own dogs. Nolan didn't stay to watch the massacre. He whistled, a sharp, low-frequency trill. Coco, Minnie, and Sprout bolted from the cave, staying low to the ground as they raced toward the dark line of the forest. "Keep moving," Nolan urged, his heart hammering. They ran through the blizzard, the wind at their backs now. Nolan didn't look back at the flashes of gunfire or the horrific sounds of the synthetic hounds turning on their masters. He had seen the truth. He had seen what happens when you treat living beings like hardware. As they reached the edge of the Whispering Woods, a dense thicket of spruce that led toward the old logging roads, Nolan stopped to catch his breath. He looked at the three puppies. They were covered in snow, their small chests heaving, but they were unharmed. Sprout looked back at the ravine, her glowing green eyes fading back to their natural dark brown. "You did good," Nolan panted, kneeling to check them over. "You're faster than they are. Smarter too." He looked at the digital drive in his pack. The truth was out of the cave, but they were still miles from the sanctuary. The Vanguard group would be sending more than just hounds now. They would be sending the heavy hitters, the ones who didn't care about cargo anymore. They would be coming to burn the forest down to hide their mistakes. Nolan stood up, his gaze hardening as he looked toward the northern horizon. The great white storm was beginning to break, revealing a sky filled with cold, distant stars. "We have to reach the extraction point," Nolan said, his voice a promise. "We have to finish what the Colonel started." He looked at Sprout, who gave a single, determined bark. The truth had been unveiled, and it was uglier than Nolan could have imagined. But as he looked at the three tiny K9s, he realized that Miller was right. They weren't just data. They were the heart of a dead hero, beating in triplicate. And Nolan Briggs was going to make sure that heart kept beating, no matter how many monsters they sent into the snow. The blizzard had finally begun to exhaust itself, the horizontal wall of white tapering into a deceptive, crystalline mist. To any other man, the clearing of the sky would have been a blessing, a chance to find the horizon and navigate towards safety. To Nolan Briggs, it was a death sentence. As the clouds peeled back like a bruised curtain, they revealed a sky filled with stars that looked like shards of ice stabbed into a black velvet canopy. The moon, fat and silver, cast a pale, ghostly light over the main wilderness, turning the snow into a vast, reflective mirror. "Visibility is up," Nolan whispered, his voice barely a breath in the freezing air. "Which means they can see us from the moon." He knelt in the deep shadow of a sprawling spruce tree, his hand resting on the hilt of his combat knife. Beside him, Coco, Minnie, and Sprout were three statues of sable and tan. They didn't shiver anymore. Their bodies had adapted to the cold with a terrifying biological efficiency that spoke to the sentinel genes coursing through their veins. Sprout's eyes were already beginning to shimmer with that faint, bioluminescent green, the thermal link activating as her brain processed the heat signatures of the forest. Nolan pulled his modified scanner from his pack. The red dots he had been tracking earlier were gone, replaced by something far more ominous. 4 blue icons were moving in a wide, sweeping pincer movement from the north. They weren't using snowmobiles anymore. They were moving on foot, their pace steady and relentless. "Night Stalkers," Nolan hissed. The Night Stalkers were Vanguard's elite Tier 1 asset, the cleaners. They didn't use barking dogs or loud engines. They were ghosts in Gore-Tex, equipped with the latest in subauditory sensors and active camouflage cloaks that blurred their outlines against the snow. They were the men who did the jobs the military couldn't admit to, and they were here for the cargo. Nolan looked at the puppies. He could see the fatigue in the way Minnie's tail drooped, but their eyes remained fixed on him, waiting for the next directive. He couldn't outrun the Night Stalkers. Not in this light. Not with 3 puppies who were barely 6 weeks old. He had to stop being the prey. "All right, ladies," Nolan murmured, his fingers dancing over the set of specialized K9 whistles hanging from his neck. Time to show them that Ares wasn't just a soldier. He was a tactician. He moved deeper into a natural bottleneck, a narrow corridor of dense spruce and frozen marshland known as the Devil's Throat. It was a place where the shadows were thickest and the ice was thinnest. He spent the next 20 minutes moving with a feverish, silent intensity. He wasn't setting lethal traps. He didn't want the blood of these men on his conscience if he could avoid it, and more importantly, he didn't want the puppies to witness a slaughter. He wanted to disorient, to delay, and to demoralize. He used paracord and the spring-loaded branches of the spruce trees to create a series of whip traps, designed to lash out at the height of a man's head. He buried his flashbangs beneath a thin layer of powder, rigging them to pressure-sensitive ice triggers he fashioned from frozen twigs. But his primary weapon wasn't the gear. Was the Puppies. "Sprout, you're the ghost?" Nolan commanded, his hand signals sharp and precise in the moonlight. "Coco, you're the flank. Minnie, stay with me. You're the trigger." The Puppies broke formation. Sprout vanished into the deep shadows of the undergrowth, her tan fur blending perfectly with the dried ferns and pine needles. Coco circled to the left, moving with a belly crawl that kept her below the line of sight. They didn't need to be told where the enemies were. They could see the thermal bloom of the Night Stalkers' bodies through the trees. Nolan climbed a jagged outcropping of rock, his carbine slung across his back. He pulled the silver whistle labeled Dissonance from his vest. This wasn't the override whistle. It was a frequency shifter designed to interfere with the Night Stalkers' electronic ear pro and communication headsets. He waited. The silence of the woods became heavy, pregnant with the coming violence. Then he saw the first shimmer. 100 yards out, the air seemed to ripple. It looked like heat haze on a summer road, but it was moving. A Night Stalker, cloaked in an active camo suit, was gliding over the snow with the grace of a predatory cat. Behind him, 3 more ripples followed. They were moving in a diamond formation, their suppressed rifles swept in a constant 180-degree arc. Sprout let out a low-frequency vibration, a sound so deep it was felt rather than heard. It was the signal. They were in the kill zone. Nolan blew the dissonance whistle. To Nolan it was a silent puff of air. But in the headsets of the Night Stalkers, it was a literal explosion of static and high-pitched feedback. He saw the lead shimmer stumble, his hands flying to his ears as the electronic sensors in his helmet overloaded. The diamond formation broke. "Now," Nolan signaled. Coco, positioned on the left flank, let out a sharp, echoing bark, not from where she was, but from a hollowed-out log 10 feet away. The sound bounced off the frozen granite, creating a sonic decoy. 2 of the Night Stalkers spun toward the sound, their rifles spitting silent, orange sparks as they peppered the empty log with lead. While they were distracted, Sprout moved like a blur of shadow. She didn't attack the men, she went for their gear. She lunged from the undergrowth, her small but powerful jaws snapping at the external battery pack of the lead stalker's camo suit. With a sharp pop and a shower of blue sparks, the cloak failed. The mercenary suddenly appeared in the moonlight, a man in charcoal gray tactical gear, his face hidden by a high-tech respirator. He let out a curse, swinging his rifle but at the thing that had just disabled his $50,000 suit. But Sprout was already gone, melting back into the darkness before the blow could land. "Pressure trigger," Nolan whispered. Minnie, sitting perfectly still 10 feet in front of the second mercenary, gave a sharp yip. The man, startled, took a heavy step backward, right onto the ice trigger Nolan had buried. Crack-boom. The flashbang detonated, the white light amplified by the surrounding snow and ice. The 2 mercenaries in the center were instantly blinded, their thermal goggles turning into searing white screens that burned their retinas. They staggered back, disoriented and screaming. One of the whip traps Nolan had set triggered as a blinded mercenary flailed his arms. A heavy spruce branch, weighted with ice, swung down with the force of a mace, catching the man squarely in the chest. He was lifted off his feet and slammed into a snowdrift, the air rushing out of his lungs in a sickening whump. Nolan didn't fire a single bullet. He didn't need to. He was using the forest as an extension of his own body, and the puppies as his peripheral senses. "Group up," the lead mercenary shouted, his voice cracking with panic. He had managed to tear off his malfunctioning headset and was squinting through the spots in his vision. "It's a trap. The target isn't alone. He's got dogs. Big ones." Nolan felt a grim satisfaction. They couldn't see the size of the puppies in the chaos and the strobe light flashes. They thought they were being hunted by a pack of full-grown K9s. "Sprout, flank 2. Nolan signaled. Sprout raced around the rear of the remaining 3 mercenaries. She began to howl, a long, mournful sound that Nolan had never heard her make before. It wasn't the mechanical howl of the synthetics. It was the chilling, primal song of a wolf. Coco and Minnie joined in, their voices overlapping until the ravine sounded like it was filled with a dozen hungry predators. The Night Stalkers, despite their elite training, were human. And humans are biologically hardwired to fear the sound of a pack in the dark. "Screw this," the 3rd mercenary yelled, firing a panicked burst into the trees. "We're being surrounded. Extract. Extract now." He turned to run, but in his blind terror, he stepped onto the thin ice patch Nolan had marked with a single pine cone. The frozen marsh gave way with a sickening, wet slap. The man plunged waist-deep into the freezing black muck of the swamp, the weight of his gear dragging him down like an anchor. The lead stalker, the only one still standing and semi-conscious, looked around the clearing. He saw the glowing green eyes of the three puppies reflecting in the moonlight, appearing and disappearing in the shadows like forest demons. He saw Nolan Briggs standing on the rock outcropping, the moonlight silhouetting him like a vengeful god of the hinterlands. Nolan raised his carbine, but he didn't aim for the man. He aimed for the tree limb directly above the mercenary's head. Thud. The suppressed round severed the frozen branch. 100 pounds of snow and ice collapsed onto the mercenary, burying him up to his neck. In less than 3 minutes, the Night Stalker unit, the best Vanguard had to offer, had been neutralized without a single casualty. They were trapped in the mud, buried in the snow, or blinded by the light, their high-tech toys reduced to useless scrap metal. Nolan hopped down from the rock, his boots crunching softly on the snow. He walked toward the lead mercenary, who was struggling to breathe under the weight of the snowbank. The man looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief as he saw the monsters that had defeated him. 3 tiny, fluffy German Shepherd puppies walked out of the shadows and sat in a row in front of him. "You were hunted by puppies," Nolan said, his voice cold and devoid of pity. "Think about that while you wait for the frostbite to set in." He reached down and stripped the mercenary of his radio and his GPS unit. He looked at the screen. The blue dots of the other units were miles away, slowed down by the same storm that Nolan had used as a shield. "Tell your handlers at Vanguard one thing," Nolan said, leaning in close. "The cargo isn't for sale. And the handler is back on the clock." He whistled, a soft, melodic note. Coco, Minnie, and Sprout immediately stood up and fell into line behind him. They didn't look back at the broken men in the snow. They looked toward the north, toward the extraction point that was now only a few hours away. As they moved out of the Devil's Throat, the moon began to set, casting long, dramatic shadows across the hinterlands. Nolan felt a strange, quiet peace settle over him. He was tired, his knee was throbbing, and he knew the hardest part of the journey was still ahead. But as he looked at Sprout, who was trotting along at his side with a proud, confident bounce in her step, he realized that he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was leading. The shadows in the snow were no longer his enemies, they were his camouflage. The silence of the woods was no longer a punishment, it was his tactical advantage. And the 3 tiny K9s? They weren't just the legacy of Ares. They were the beginning of a new breed of hero. Nolan reached the edge of the old logging road, the wide, flat expanse of the trail clear in the starlight. He checked his watch. 4 hours until dawn. 4 hours to reach the sanctuary and change the world. "Come on, soldiers," he whispered. "Let's go home." But as he stepped onto the road, a low, rhythmic thumping sound began to vibrate through the soles of his boots. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't a snowmobile. It was a heavy-lift helicopter, its black silhouette cutting across the stars like a prehistoric bird of prey. The Vanguard group was done playing games. They were bringing in the heavy iron. Nolan's grip tightened on his carbine. He looked at the puppies who had already dropped into a defensive crouch. "One last stand," Nolan breathed. "Make it count." The logging depot was a rusted graveyard of forgotten industry, a jagged collection of corrugated metal sheds and skeletal cranes huddled at the edge of the frozen river. In the pale, pre-dawn light, the site looked like a shipwreck stranded in a sea of snow. To Nolan, however, it was a tactical gold mine. He moved through the shadows of a massive timber hauler, his breath hitching as the rhythmic, chest-thumping vibration of the helicopter grew from a distant hum to a localized roar. Into the shed. "Now," Nolan commanded, his voice a sharp, low-frequency rasp. Coco, Minnie, and Sprout didn't hesitate. They were a blur of tan and black, their paws barely touching the crusted snow as they bolted toward the largest structure, a sagging maintenance bay filled with the scent of ancient diesel and oxidized iron. Nolan followed, his boots skidding on a patch of black ice before he ducked behind a stack of rusted oil drums. He didn't just need cover, he needed a thermal shield. The helicopter, a modified MH-60 Black Hawk painted in the matte black livery of the Vanguard group, swept over the treeline like a predatory bird. Its searchlight cut through the mist, a blinding white pillar of light that turned the snow into diamonds. But it wasn't the light Nolan feared, it was the gimbal, the multispectral thermal turret slung beneath the nose. He knew that to those sensors, he and the puppies were glowing beacons of heat against the sub-zero landscape. "Thermal masking, girls," Nolan whispered, dragging a heavy oil-soaked tarp over the puppies. "Stay under. Do not move until I whistle." He looked around the shed. It was a cavernous space filled with the ghosts of industry, a dormant sawmill, rows of logging chains, and a massive, gravity-fed fuel tank that towered over the northern wall. Nolan's mind, sharpened by a decade of unconventional warfare, began to map the room not as a shelter, but as a weapon. He reached into his pack and pulled out a handful of road flares and a roll of duct tape. He moved with a feverish, practiced speed, taping the flares to the exhaust manifolds of the various dead tractors scattered around the yard. He wasn't trying to start a fire, not yet. He was creating heat decoys. If he could ignite them simultaneously, the helicopter's thermal cannons would be blinded by a dozen artificial suns, unable to distinguish a human heartbeat from a magnesium burn. Outside, the roar of the rotors reached a crescendo. The downwash hit the shed, making the corrugated metal groan and rattle like a dying beast. "They're landing," Nolan hissed. He looked at Sprout. The puppy had poked her nose out from beneath the tarp. Her eyes weren't brown anymore. They were pulsing with that eerie, bioluminescent green. Her ears were swept back and she was staring intently at the ceiling. She gave a low, vibrating growl, a warning. A split second later, the roof erupted. The helicopter's 20mm thermal tracking cannon opened fire, the rounds tearing through the thin metal roof like it was parchment. Thud, 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 thud. The sound was deafening, a jackhammer of destruction that sent sparks and molten lead raining down into the shed. Nolan threw himself over the tarp, shielding the puppies with his own body as a line of fire walked across the floor, missing them by less than a yard. "Go, go, go," Nolan roared. He grabbed the puppies and scrambled toward the heavy machinery at the back of the bay. The Delimber, a massive clawed machine used to strip branches from trees. Its thick steel plating was the only thing capable of stopping a 20mm round. The cannon fire ceased as the helicopter repositioned, but the silence that followed was even more terrifying. Nolan heard the distinctive clack-clack of fast ropes being deployed. The final wave of ground troops was coming in. These wouldn't be the corporate Night Stalkers, or the panicked mercenaries from the ravine. These would be the reclamation team, the men who built the project coming to retrieve their property and erase the witness. Nolan pulled a specialized whistle from his neck, one he hadn't used yet. It was marked with a red band, the siren. "Sprout, Minnie, Coco, listen to me," Nolan said, kneeling in the dark as the first shadows of the mercenaries appeared in the doorway. "You were bred for this. You have the senses. You have the speed. I need you to be my eyes in the dark. If they move, you bark. If they aim, you bite. Understood?" Sprout let out a sharp, authoritative bark. It wasn't the sound of a puppy. It was the sound of a soldier accepting a mission. Nolan clicked his carbine to semi-auto and peered around the edge of the Delimber. He saw 4 men entering from the main bay, their silhouettes framed by the white glare of the helicopter spotlight. They were moving in a professional stack, their suppressed rifles held in a low-ready position. They weren't using flashlights. They were using the same thermal link technology that was inside the puppy's brains. "I'm going to blind them," Nolan whispered. He reached up and pulled the release valve on the gravity-fed fuel tank. A torrent of old, stabilized diesel spilled across the concrete floor, pooling around the mercenaries' boots. Then he fired a single shot into the line of flares he had set earlier. The shed exploded into a kaleidoscope of light. The flares ignited with a brilliant, magnesium-white hiss, creating a wall of heat that completely white-outed the mercenaries' thermal goggles. "My eyes. I'm blind," one of them screamed, tearing his goggles off. "Now," Nolan signaled. The puppies launched. They didn't run together. They split up, utilizing the three-dimensional space of the depot. Coco leaped onto a conveyor belt, running along the rafters like a cat. Minnie dove beneath the chassis of a truck, and Sprout, the smallest and fastest, became a blur of shadow on the floor. As the mercenaries struggled to adjust to the light, Coco dropped from the rafters directly onto the shoulders of the lead soldier. She didn't bite to kill. She went for the tactical headset, her tiny teeth shredding the wires in the man's ear in one swift motion. The soldier let out a howl of pain, spinning in circles and firing his rifle into the ceiling. Minnie emerged from beneath the truck, nipping at the ankles of the second soldier, darting in and out of the shadows before he could lower his weapon. The man was firing at ghosts, his bullets striking the rusted metal of the machines, creating a cacophony of ricochets that added to the chaos. Nolan used the distraction to move. He flanked the third soldier, rising from behind an oil drum like a specter. He didn't use his rifle. He used a heavy logging chain he'd retrieved from the wall. He swung it in a wide arc, the heavy links catching the soldier across the helmet, sending him crashing into the diesel-soaked floor. "Target sighted," the fourth mercenary shouted, his voice cracking. He had managed to stabilize his vision and was aiming his rifle directly at Nolan. Sprout didn't wait for a command. She launched herself from a stack of timber, her small body flying through the air with an impossible gravity-defying grace. She struck the mercenary's rifle, her weight and momentum knocking the barrel upward just as he pulled the trigger. The rounds went wide, striking the overhead fuel line. A secondary spray of diesel erupted, drenching the mercenary. "Clear out!" Nolan yelled, grabbing Sprout from the air. He blew a sharp, trilling note on his whistle. Coco and Minnie abandoned their targets and raced toward the back exit. Nolan pulled a final flare from his vest, struck it, and tossed it into the pool of diesel. The floor of the logging depot turned into a lake of fire. The diesel burned with a thick, black smoke that filled the shed, creating a physical barrier between Nolan and the remaining mercenaries. The heat was immense, a roaring wall of orange that challenged the cold of the Maine morning. Nolan burst through the back door, the puppies at his heels. They were outside now, standing on the edge of the frozen river. The helicopter was circling back, its pilot realizing that the ground team had been compromised. "The ice!" Nolan shouted. "We have to cross." The frozen river was a treacherous expanse of jagged white plates and dark, swirling patches of soft ice. It was a gamble, but it was their only way to reach the extraction point on the northern bank. As they stepped onto the ice, the helicopter hovered directly overhead. The door gunner swung a heavy machine gun into position, the barrel tracking the heat of Nolan's body. "No," Nolan whispered, looking at the puppies. "Not them." He stopped. He turned to face the helicopter, standing in the middle of the river, a lone man against a multi-million-dollar war machine. He raised his carbine not to fire but to draw their attention. "Hey, look at me," he roared, his voice carrying over the sound of the rotors. The gunner opened fire. The ice around Nolan exploded in a spray of white shards. He dove to the left, sliding across a slick plate of ice as the bullets chased him. But the puppies didn't run away. They didn't leave him. Sprout ran back toward Nolan, her green eyes glowing with a fierce, protective light. She stood between him and the helicopter, her small chest puffed out, her ears forward. She let out a bark that was so loud, so resonant, that it seemed to vibrate the very ice beneath their feet. Suddenly, the helicopter's engine began to cough. A thick, oily smoke billowed from the turbine. Nolan looked up, confused. Then he saw it. The siren whistle wasn't just for the dogs. It was a high-frequency transmitter designed to interfere with the specific avionics of the Vanguard aircraft. A parting gift Miller had built into the gear. The whistle, combined with the extreme cold and the smoke from the fire, had triggered a critical sensor failure in the Black Hawk's engine. The helicopter began to spin, its tail rotor clipping the top of a frozen hemlock. The pilot fought for control, but the machine was a dead weight. It veered away from the river, crashing into a snowbank 100 yards away with a dull, muffled thump. It didn't explode, but the rotors were shattered and the reclamation team was grounded. Silence returned to the river, broken only by the crackling of the fire in the distance and the heavy panting of a man and 3 puppies. Nolan sat up, his limbs shaking with exhaustion. He looked at Sprout, who was standing over him, her tail giving a single, tired wag. Coco and Minnie came trotting over, their coats singed and covered in soot, but their spirits unbroken. "You did it," Nolan whispered, pulling them into a huddle. "You really did it." He looked across the river. On the northern bank, a set of headlights flickered, 3 short, 2 long. The extraction. The debt he had called in from his old general was finally arriving. Nolan stood up, his knee screaming in protest, but his heart feeling lighter than it had in a decade. He looked back at the burning logging depot, the smoke rising into the dawn sky like a funeral pyre for his old life. The battle for the depot was over, but the war for the truth was just beginning. He led the puppies across the remaining ice, their paws steady and sure. As they reached the northern bank, a ruggedized armored transport pulled into view. A man in an old army field jacket stepped out, a man Nolan hadn't seen in years. "Briggs?" the man asked, squinting through the morning light. "I heard you were dead." Nolan looked down at the 3 tiny K9s sitting at his feet, their eyes bright with intelligence and a future that had once seemed impossible. "I was," Nolan said, a faint, genuine smile finally touching his lips. "But I got drafted again." He picked up Sprout, tucking her into his coat. "Let's get these soldiers home. We've got a lot of work to do." As the transport sped away from the river, the first rays of the Maine sun broke over the horizon, turning the white world into gold. The hermit was gone. The jinx was broken. And the legacy of Ares was finally in the hands of the only man who knew that a dog isn't a weapon, it's a partner. The adrenaline that had sustained Nolan Briggs through the river crossing began to ebb, replaced by a cold, leaden exhaustion that felt as though it were settling into his very bone marrow. The northern bank of the river was a jagged shoreline of frozen mud and skeletal alders, a landscape that offered little in the way of comfort but provided the necessary concealment for the final leg of their journey. Behind them, the logging depot was a smoldering wound on the horizon, the black smoke from the diesel fire curling into the brightening sky like a signal fire from a lost era. The Black Hawk helicopter remained a twisted, silent carcass in the snow, a multi-million-dollar monument to the arrogance of the Vanguard group. Nolan trudged through the drifts, his boots heavy, his breath coming in shallow, ragged plumes. Beside him, the three puppies moved with a ghostly quiet. Coco and Minnie stayed close to his heels, their bodies occasionally brushing against his shins for reassurance, but Sprout, the smallest of the trio, the one with the white-specked ear and the eyes that held the secrets of a dead colonel, was different. She ranged slightly ahead, her nose to the wind, her ears constantly swiveling. She wasn't just a puppy anymore, she was a scout. She was navigating the terrain with a level of intentionality that defied her age and size. The extraction point was a disused fire watchtower 3 miles north, situated on a high ridge that offered a 360-degree view of the hinterlands. It was the debt Nolan had called in, a favor from an old general who knew that some wars never truly end, and that some soldiers never truly come home. But as Nolan reached the base of the ridge, a prickle of unease crawled up his spine. It was a sensation he hadn't felt since the days before the Kabul ambush, a phantom itch between his shoulder blades that whispered of a presence that shouldn't be there. He stopped, raising a hand. Coco and Minnie sat instantly, their training as rigid as stone. Sprout, however, didn't sit. She stood frozen, her head tilted toward a dense cluster of pines near the base of the tower. Her hackles were raised, a thin line of fur standing on end like a jagged ridge. "What is it, girl?" Nolan whispered, his voice barely audible over the sigh of the wind. He reached for his carbine, but his movements were sluggish. The night's exertion, the cold, and the sheer emotional toll of the truth he carried in his pack had finally caught up to him. His vision blurred for a second, a flash of gray tunneling his sight. He blinked it away, shaking his head to clear the cobwebs of fatigue. He was so close. The armored transport was supposed to be waiting just over the crest. But Vanguard wasn't done. A shadow detached itself from the pines, a shape so fluid and well camouflaged that it seemed to materialize out of the very air. It was the lead Night Stalker, the mercenary Nolan had buried in the snowbank at the Devil's Throat. He had survived. He had clawed his way out of the ice, driven by a primal corporate-fueled rage that had stripped away the last of his professional veneer. He was covered in frost, his tactical gear torn, his face a mask of bruised, frozen fury. And in his hand, he held a sidearm, a high-caliber pistol aimed directly at Nolan's chest. "You should have killed me when you had the chance, Briggs," the mercenary rasped, his voice a wet, broken sound. He was shivering, but the hand holding the gun was steady. "You think you're a hero? You're just a thief. You're stealing the future. Those things, those dogs, they don't belong to you." Nolan tried to raise his carbine, but his right arm felt like it was made of lead. His scarred knee buckled, sending a jolt of white-hot pain through his leg. He went down on one knee, the snow swallowing his thigh. He was a perfect target, a stationary mark in the morning light. The mercenary's finger tightened on the trigger. In that fraction of a second, Nolan saw the end. He saw Ares. He saw the fire in Kabul. He saw the long, cold silence of the Maine woods finally claiming him. Then the world erupted. It wasn't a growl. It wasn't a whimper. It was a bark, a sound so sharp, so authoritative, and so utterly unexpected that it shattered the tension like a hammer on glass. Sprout didn't lung for the man's throat. She knew she was too small for that. Instead, she launched herself into the air, her tiny body a blur of tan and black, and she let out a rhythmic, three-toned disruptor bark, a sequence Nolan recognized from the highest levels of canine psychological warfare training. The mercenary flinched. It was a purely biological reaction, a flinch born of the sudden, piercing frequency that bypassed his conscious mind and struck his lizard brain. His aim wavered for a single heartbeat, a second of distraction that was all the opening Nolan needed. The soldier in Nolan, the one who had survived 1,000 near-deaths, took over. He lunged forward from his kneeling position, ignoring the scream of his knee. He didn't fire his weapon. He used the weight of his own body. He struck the mercenary's wrist with the butt of his carbine, the metallic clack of bone meeting steel echoing through the clearing. The pistol flew from the man's hand, spinning into the deep powder. Nolan didn't stop. He followed through with a shoulder check that sent the frozen, exhausted mercenary reeling backward. The man hit the ground hard, the air rushing out of his lungs in a sickening gasp. Nolan was on him in an instant, pinning his arms, his combat knife held at the man's throat. "It's over," Nolan growled, the cold steel of the blade pressing against the mercenary's skin. "The future just saved my life. What did you ever do for it?" The mercenary stared up at him, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and a dawning, terrifying realization. He looked past Nolan to the three puppies. They weren't cowering. They weren't hiding. They stood in a semicircle, watching the fallen man with a calm, analytical gaze that was entirely alien to the nature of a 6-week-old animal. Sprout stood in the center, her tail giving a single sharp wag of triumph. Nolan felt the man's resistance crumble. The mercenary went limp, the fight drained out of him by the realization that he hadn't been defeated by a veteran soldier, but by the very cargo he had been sent to reclaim. "They're not just dogs," the mercenary whispered, his voice trembling. There's something else. "They're heroes," Nolan said, his voice hardening. "And you're a footnote." He pulled a pair of heavy-duty zip ties from his vest and secured the man's hands, then rolled him onto his stomach in the snow. He wouldn't leave him to die. Nolan wasn't a murderer, but the man wouldn't be following them any further. Nolan stood up, his legs shaking, and looked at Sprout. The puppy walked over to him, her head cocked, her green thermal eyes fading back to their natural, soulful brown. She nudged his hand with her cold, wet nose, and for the first time in 3 years, Nolan felt a surge of emotion that wasn't grief or rage. It was pride. He reached down and scooped her up, holding her close to his chest. He could feel the rapid, steady thrum of her heart, a heartbeat that was a direct continuation of Aries' own. He looked at Coco and Minnie, who were now trotting over to join the huddle. "You did it, Sprout," Nolan whispered, his voice cracking. "You gave me the second I needed. You saved me." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He had spent the last 24 hours thinking of these puppies as a burden, as a legacy to be protected, as the cargo. He had thought of himself as the shield, the one who stood between them and the world. But in that moment he realized that the relationship was reciprocal. They weren't just the legacy of a dead dog, they were his partners. They were a unit. They were already capable of bravery that surpassed most men he had served with. He looked at the watchtower on the ridge. The armored transport had arrived, its heavy engine idling, the dark shape of the vehicle a promise of safety. 2 men in tactical gear, real soldiers, not mercenaries, were descending the slope to meet him. "Briggs," one of them called out. "We've got you. Is the cargo secure?" Nolan looked at the puppies, then back at the soldiers. He didn't like the word cargo. It felt small. It felt cold. "The unit is secure," Nolan shouted back, his voice steady and strong. As he began the final climb toward the transport, the sun finally cleared the trees, bathing the entire ridge in a brilliant, blinding gold. The Maine wilderness, which had been a place of exile and punishment for 3 long years, suddenly felt different. It didn't feel like a cage anymore. It felt like a foundation. Nolan realized that the truth Miller had sent him wasn't just about the conspiracy or the genetic engineering. The truth was that Aries hadn't died to save Nolan's life just so Nolan could waste it in a cabin in the woods. Aries had saved him so he could be there for this moment, so he could be the handler for a new generation of souls who would change the way the world saw loyalty and protection. He reached the transport and handed Sprout to one of the soldiers, who took her with a look of bewildered awe. "This is it? This is what all the fuss is about." "Watch your tone, Sergeant," Nolan said, a ghost of a smirk appearing on his face. "That puppy has a higher combat IQ than you do. She just took down a night stalker with a bark." He watched as Coco and Minnie were ushered into the back of the armored vehicle, followed by the digital drive and the colonel's lockbox. The soldiers began to treat the puppies not as animals, but as VIPs, their movements careful and respectful. Nolan took one last look back at the valley. The fire at the logging depot was almost out, the smoke a thin, fading ribbon against the blue sky. He thought of the journey ahead, the debriefings, the legal battles, the danger that would surely follow them as they worked to expose the Vanguard group. But the fear was gone. The internal frost that had gripped his heart since Kabul had finally thawed, melted away by the warmth of 3 small lives. He stepped into the back of the transport and pulled the heavy steel door shut, plunging them into the dim, humming interior. He sat on the bench and immediately, all 3 puppies scrambled into his lap, a chaotic, warm mass of fur and licking tongues. Yeah, Nolan laughed, the sound rusty and strange in his own ears. "I know. We've still got work to do." Sprout settled herself in the center of the pile, her head resting on Nolan's knee, her eyes closed in a well-deserved sleep. Nolan leaned his head back against the armored wall, the vibration of the engine a soothing lullaby. He wasn't the hermit of the hinterlands anymore. He wasn't a man running from ghosts. He was a man with a mission, a man with a unit, and a man who finally knew that even in the loneliest winter, you never truly have to walk alone. The transport lurched forward, heading toward a future that was no longer written in the shadows of the past, but in the brave, bright eyes of three tiny K9s who had proven that they were already and always would be heroes. The sky over northern Maine did not simply clear, it surrendered. As the armored transport churned its way through the deepening drifts toward a hidden airstrip carved into the pine-choked wilderness, the suffocating purple-gray of the blizzard finally fractured. It began as a sliver of pale, watery blue on the eastern horizon, a jagged tear in the fabric of the storm that allowed the first true sunlight in days to pour over the landscape. The effect was transformative. The world, which had been a claustrophobic cage of white noise and lethal cold, was suddenly revealed in a brilliant, blinding clarity. Every hemlock branch was encased in a shimmering armor of ice, and the vast, undulating snowfields sparkled with the intensity of crushed diamonds. It was a landscape of peace that belied the violence of the night, a silent witness to a war that was transitioning from the physical to the political. Inside the belly of the transport, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of gun oil, wet wool, and the unmistakable earthy musk of 3 exhausted puppies. Nolan Briggs sat with his back against the vibrating metal hull, his eyes fixed on the small window opposite him. He watched the shadows of the pines sweep across the snow, his mind finally beginning to process the sheer weight of what he carried. Beside him, Coco and Minnie had fallen into the deep, twitching sleep of the truly spent, their paws paddling against the air as they chased imaginary threats in their dreams. But Sprout remained awake, her chin resting on Nolan's knee, her eyes following the movement of the soldiers in the cabin with a quiet, analytical intensity that sent a cold thrill through Nolan's chest. He reached into the inner pocket of his parka and felt the hard, rectangular edge of the digital drive, the black box of the Sentinel project. It felt heavier than it should have, a piece of silicon and plastic that held enough explosive data to topple senators, dissolve a multi-billion-dollar private military firm, and rewrite the history of his own service. He knew that the moment he stepped off this transport, the silent war would begin. "Approaching the LZ, sir," the sergeant seated across from him said, his voice respectful but cautious. He kept glancing at the puppies, his eyes lingering on the faint, fading green glow in their pupils. "General Vance is waiting. He's in a state, Briggs. He doesn't like being called out to the middle of nowhere on a holiday weekend." Nolan didn't blink. "The general owes me more than a weekend, Sergeant. He owes me the truth about Kabul. And today he's going to pay up." The transport slowed, its heavy treads grinding to a halt on the tarmac of a remote, military-grade airfield that didn't appear on any civilian map. This was a black site used for off-the-books extractions, the kind of place where men like Nolan were usually disappeared, not rescued. But Nolan wasn't a victim today. He was the man holding the keys. The heavy hydraulic ramp hissed open, and the cold Maine air rushed in, though it lacked the predatory bite of the storm. Nolan stood, his scarred knee clicking in protest, and gathered the puppies. He didn't use a leash. He didn't need to. A single low-frequency click of his tongue brought Coco and Minnie to their feet, and they followed him out into the light in a perfect, silent file. Standing at the edge of the runway, flanked by 2 black SUVs and a small group of grim-faced MPs, was General Marcus Vance. He was a man made of granite and starch, his uniform crisp despite the remote location, his silver hair a sharp contrast to the dark, winter-weight coat he wore. He watched Nolan approach, his eyes narrowing as they moved from the veteran's battered face to the 3 tiny German shepherds trotting at his heels. "Briggs," Vance said, his voice a deep, gravelly baritone that had commanded divisions. "You look like you've walked through hell and brought back the souvenirs." "I did more than walk through it, Marcus," Nolan replied, stopping 10 feet from the general. The MPs shifted uncomfortably, sensing the lack of formal protocol. "I survived it. Again." Vance stepped forward, his gaze fixed on Sprout. The puppy didn't shy away. She sat squarely in the center of the tarmac and stared up at the general with an unwavering focus. "So, these are them. The Delta samples. Miller's final act of defiance." "They're not samples," Nolan said, his voice hardening. "They're the reason Ares died. They're the reason my unit was erased. And they're the only ones left who can tell the story." Vance sighed, a plume of frost escaping his lips. "Let's get inside." The Vanguard Group is already filing injunctions and screaming about intellectual property theft to the Oversight Committee. We have about 6 hours before the lawyers make it impossible for me to protect you. They moved into a small clinical briefing room inside the airfield's hangar. The walls were bare, the air smelling of ozone and floor wax. Nolan sat at the table, the puppies huddling beneath his chair, while Vance stood by a large monitor. Nolan pulled the digital drive from his pocket and slid it across the table. It looked small on the polished wood, almost insignificant. Everything is on there. The breeding logs, the neural mapping of Ares, the names of the Vanguard executives who authorized the terminal field test in Kabul. It's all there, Marcus. Every lie they told us. Vance picked up the drive, turning it over in his hand. If I turn this over to the Department of Justice, Vanguard will be liquidated. But it won't be clean, Nolan. They'll fight. They'll try to discredit you. They'll say you're a PTSD-riddled hermit who stole classified assets. Let them, Nolan said. I've been a ghost for 3 years. I'm used to people not believing I exist. But the data doesn't lie. And neither do the dogs. The general signaled to a technician, who took the drive and plugged it into a secure terminal. For the next 2 hours, the room was filled with the flickering blue light of the monitor as the Sentinel project was laid bare. Nolan watched as the schematics of the neural links appeared, the same links that were currently pulsing inside the puppies beneath his chair. He saw the videos of the synthetic dogs, the horrifying failures of the Charlie line, and the clinical, cold-blooded notes on how to decommission any asset that showed signs of empathy. As the final file closed, the room was silent. Even the MPs at the door looked away, unable to stomach the level of depravity documented on the drive. General Vance looked at Nolan, his expression unreadable. Miller was right to send them to you, Vance whispered. You're the only one who wouldn't see them as a weapon system. But that brings us to the next problem, Nolan. Vance walked over to the puppies and knelt down, a gesture that seemed entirely out of character for a 3-star general. He reached out a hand and Sprout sniffed it cautiously before allowing him to touch her ears. The government is going to want them, Vance said softly. The pure samples. DARPA, the K9 Training Center at Lackland, the CIA. They'll all want to study the Delta line to see how Miller fixed the aggression. They'll want to know how the neural link integrates with their natural instincts. Nolan felt a cold, familiar dread settle in his stomach. Study them? You mean put them in a cage? You mean turn them back into the hardware Miller died to save them from? I can protect them for a while, Vance said, looking up at Nolan. But they are technically government property, Nolan. Developed with black budget funds. The legal precedent is on their side. Nolan stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. The puppies immediately rose with him, forming a tight defensive perimeter around his legs. They didn't growl, but the air in the room seemed to vibrate with a sudden, collective tension. No, Nolan said, his voice low and dangerous. They're not property. They're soldiers. And as their superior officer, I'm denying the transfer. Nolan, be reasonable. I was reasonable for 10 years, Marcus. Nolan roared, the sound echoing off the sterile walls. I was reasonable when they told me Ares died in an accident. I was reasonable when they gave me a medal and a discharge and told me to go hide in the woods. I'm done being reasonable. He stepped toward the general, his eyes blazing with a decade of suppressed fury. These puppies didn't just survive a blizzard and a mercenary hit squad to end up in a lab. They saved my life on that river. Sprout stood down a night stalker for me. They've done more for this country in 6 weeks than the suits at Vanguard have done in their entire lives. Vance stood up slowly, dusting off his trousers. He looked at Nolan, then at the 3 tiny, fierce creatures at his feet. He saw the bond, the invisible, unbreakable tether between the handler and his unit. He saw a man who had finally found something worth more than his own survival. You realize what you're asking for, Vance said. If you keep them, you're a target for the rest of your life. Vanguard might fall, but there will be others. They won't stop wanting what's inside their heads. Then let them come, Nolan said, his voice settling into a cold, lethal calm. I spent 3 years waiting for the end. I'm not waiting anymore. I have a new mission now. He knelt down and gathered the puppies to him, his large hands resting on their small shoulders. He looked at Coco, Minnie, and Sprout, and he knew, with a certainty that felt like a divine revelation, that he couldn't let them go. He couldn't hand them over to a system that saw them as assets. He was the only one who saw them for what they were, the best part of his past and the only hope for his future. I'm keeping them, Nolan said, looking Vance in the eye. And I'm not just keeping them. I'm going to finish the work Miller started. I'm going to turn my land in Maine into a sanctuary. A place for dogs like this, dogs the world thinks are broken or too much. A place where the sentinel line can live without being a weapon. Vance was silent for a long time. Then he let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh. You always were a stubborn bastard, Briggs. That's why Miller loved you. The general turned to the technician. Wipe the drive of any references to the location of Nolan's property. Secure a non-disclosure and a protection of asset order for the Delta Line, citing, let's call it active field evaluation, under the custody of a specialized handler. He looked back at Nolan. I can give you a year, Nolan. A year where the paperwork will be so thick even the CIA won't be able to find you. After that, you're on your own. You'll have to show the world that these dogs are better off with you than in a lab. I only need a year, Nolan said. By then they'll be grown. And heaven help anyone who tries to take them then. The storm had cleared, and in its wake, the path was finally visible. Nolan led the puppies out of the briefing room and back toward the armored transport. He wasn't going to a black site. He wasn't going to a witness protection program. He was going home. As they boarded the vehicle for the final leg of the trip back to the Allagash, Nolan looked at Sprout. She was sitting by the door, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and fire. She looked at him, her green eyes fading into a warm, intelligent brown, and she gave a single, satisfied wag of her tail. The new mission had begun. It wasn't about war and it wasn't about revenge. It was about redemption. It was about the 3 tiny K9s who had found a broken man in a blizzard and taught him how to be a hero again. Nolan reached out and stroked Sprout's ears, his heart finally at peace. The truth was out, the corruption was exposed, and for the first time in his life, he had something to protect that wasn't a secret. He had a family. Come on, girls, he whispered as the transport roared to life. Let's go build a sanctuary. The vehicle sped away from the airfield, disappearing into the vast, golden expanse of the Maine hinterlands. The era of the hermit was over. The era of the Aries sanctuary had begun. The Maine woods had a way of reclaiming what was stolen, but they also had a way of nurturing what was planted with intent. 1 year had passed since the great white blizzard nearly turned Nolan Briggs into a frozen footnote in a corporate conspiracy, and the landscape had transformed twice over. The savage, predatory ice of that winter had long ago surrendered to a vibrant emerald spring, which in turn had matured into a golden, bustling summer. Now, as the first hints of a new autumn began to touch the tips of the hemlocks with fire and bronze, the silence that once defined Nolan's life was gone. It had been replaced not by the chaos of war, but by the rhythmic, purposeful symphony of a mission reborn. The cabin was no longer a lonely fortress of self-imposed exile. It had breathed outward, expanding with the help of local veterans and the debt General Vance had continued to pay in the form of building materials and legal shielding. A new, sprawling wing of cedar and stone now housed a state-of-the-art veterinary clinic and a row of heated, spacious kennels. Solar panels glinted on the south-facing roof, and a high-tensile fence, designed to keep the curious out and the residents safe, ran the perimeter of what the local maps now officially labeled as the Aries Sanctuary for Retired Service Animals. Nolan Briggs stood on the wide wraparound porch, a mug of coffee in his hand. He looked different. The haunted, hollowed-out look in his eyes had been replaced by a quiet, steady alertness. His hair was a little longer, his beard trimmed, and the permanent hunch in his shoulders had smoothed into the relaxed posture of a man who knew exactly where he stood in the world. He was no longer a hermit. He was the director. At the edge of the clearing, the morning's training session was already in full swing. But it wasn't the rigid, lethal drills of the Sentinel Project. It was something deeper. Coco Holt. Minnie Flank. Sprout. Find, Nolan called out, his voice strong and clear, carrying across the crisp morning air without the rasp of desperation it once held. The 3 tiny K9s were no longer tiny. They had grown into magnificent, powerful examples of the German Shepherd breed, their coats thick and glossy, their bodies rippling with the engineered muscle of their heritage. Coco and Minnie had filled out into sturdy, reliable guardians, their temperaments a perfect balance of protective instinct and gentle loyalty. They were currently working with a retired police dog, a Belgian Malinois named Jax who had lost a leg to a roadside bomb in Chicago. They weren't just training Jax. They were socializing him, teaching him that his value didn't end with his physical perfection. But it was Sprout who remained the heart of the unit. She was slightly leaner than her sisters, her movements possessing a fluid, almost supernatural grace. As Nolan gave the find command, she didn't just sniff the air. She tilted her head, her ears swiveling with that familiar, analytical precision. For a fleeting second, her eyes shimmered with that bioluminescent green, the neural link now fully integrated and under her total control. She wasn't a slave to the technology, she was its master. She vanished into the brush, and 30 seconds later she emerged from the far side of the clearing, nudging a lost hiker, actually a young veteran named Elias who was participating in the sanctuary's new canine-assisted therapy program. Elias was laughing, his hands buried in Sprout's thick fur, the shadow of the PTSD he carried seemingly lighter in her presence. Nolan watched them, a faint smile touching his lips. The truth had been a hard-won victory. The digital drive he had carried out of the storm had done its work. The Vanguard Group had been dismantled in a series of high-profile congressional hearings that had dominated the news for months. The Superdog project had been exposed as a violation of international ethics, and the senators on the payroll had been forced into shameful resignations. But for Nolan, the real victory wasn't in the headlines. It was in the silence of the woods that was now filled with the sound of healing. The general had kept his word. The Ares Sanctuary was a protected entity, a black site of a different kind. One dedicated to the preservation of the souls that the military-industrial complex had tried to turn into hardware. As the morning session wound down, Elias led Jax back toward the kennels, giving Nolan a thumbs up as he passed. Nolan stepped off the porch, his boots crunching on the gravel path he had laid himself. He whistled, a soft, melodic three-note trill. The effect was instantaneous. Coco and Minnie abandoned their posts and raced toward him, their tails wagging with a force that threatened to knock over the porch furniture. They reached him first, a chaotic mass of fur and enthusiasm, leaning their heavy heads against his thighs. Nolan laughed, a sound that no longer felt foreign in his throat, and reached down to scratch their ears. "Yeah, I see you. Good work today, girls," he murmured. Then came Sprout. She didn't run. She walked with a measured, regal pace, her eyes fixed on Nolan's. When she reached him, she didn't jump or bark. She sat squarely in front of him and rose onto her hind legs, lifting her front paws in that tactical beg that had once chilled Nolan's blood. But now it wasn't a report for duty or a plea for mercy. She held the pose for a second, then leaned forward, resting her paws against Nolan's chest and lashing his cheek with a warm, wet tongue. "You're a show-off," Nolan whispered, pulling her into a hug. He stayed there for a moment, kneeling in the dirt with the 3 daughters of Ares, the sun warming his back. He thought of Colonel Miller and the sacrifice he had made. He thought of Ares, the partner who had died so that Nolan could live long enough to find his true purpose. The grief was still there, it would always be there, but it was no longer a poison. It was a foundation. He stood up and walked toward a small, quiet grove of trees behind the cabin. There, under the shade of a massive, ancient oak, sat 2 simple markers of Maine granite. One bore the name Ares and the other Colonel Jonathan Miller. There were no long epitaphs, no lists of medals. Just the names and the dates. Nolan knelt between the stones, Sprout sitting solemnly by his side. He pulled a small silver locket from his pocket, the one he had found in the hidden pocket of Ares's vest. He opened it, looking at the faded photo of his old unit. They were all gone now except for him. But as he looked at the thriving sanctuary around him, he realized he hadn't just survived. He had redeemed their memory. "We did it, Ares," Nolan whispered to the wind. "They're safe. They're whole. And they're teaching me how to be human again." Sprout let out a soft, low-frequency huff, a sound of agreement that vibrated in Nolan's chest. The peace Nolan had found wasn't the fragile, hollow peace of isolation. It was the robust, hard-earned peace of a man who had faced his demons and recruited them into his service. He had realized that he wasn't a jinx. He was a catalyst. His skills as a protector, a handler, and a soldier weren't a curse. They were the tools required to build a haven in a world that often forgot its most loyal servants. He stood up and looked toward the driveway as a dusty pickup truck pulled in. It was a local farmer, bringing a retired sheepdog that had become too old to work the flocks. Nolan straightened his vest, the one he had designed for the sanctuary, featuring the silhouette of a dog's head inside a shield. "New arrival, girls," Nolan said. Coco and Minnie immediately stood at attention, their guardian modes clicking in. Sprout looked at the truck, then back at Nolan, her tail giving a single, confident wag. The new mission was no longer new. It was life. The Ares Sanctuary had become a beacon, a place where the broken were mended and the forgotten were remembered. And at the center of it all was a veteran who had found his heart in the paws of 3 tiny puppies who wouldn't stop crying for help. Nolan walked toward the truck, his gait steady, his head held high. As he greeted the farmer and reached out to take the leash of the old sheepdog, he felt a profound sense of belonging. The war had ended for everyone else years ago, but for Nolan Briggs, it had finally ended here, in the golden light of a Maine autumn, surrounded by the family he had fought so hard to save. He looked back one last time at the 3 grown shepherds watching him from the porch. They were the legacy of a hero, the secret of a colonel, and the salvation of a hermit. But to Nolan they were simply his girls. The hermit of the hinterlands was gone. In his place stood a man who knew that the truth wasn't just found in encrypted drives or military reports. The truth was found in the wet nose of a dog, the warmth of a fire, and the knowledge that no matter how deep the snow or how dark the night, hope always finds a way to report for duty. Nolan smiled, led the new dog toward the kennels, and stepped into the rest of his life. Aries gave his life in the sands of Kabul so that Nolan could survive to see this day. Colonel Miller gave everything to ensure these 3 puppies wouldn't become weapons of war. They didn't turn their backs on their mission, so please don't turn your back on theirs. If you believe every hero deserves a home, hit that like button and subscribe to join our sanctuary. Don't let their story fade into the silence of the Maine woods. Comment, healed, below to show Nolan and his girls that they aren't standing alone anymore.